So far in this lecture series, we've said that what we know about the Great Depression often is kind of a stereotypical picture that doesn't really mesh well with what we know in economics. And we've asked the question, so what can we know about the Great Depression? This little section here isn't really going to answer that question. We're going to look at the causes of the Great Depression. We're not going to focus on this too much because there is still debate about what caused the Great Depression. One story that we can put out there for you to consider, though, is the Austrian story. Right. So the Austrian story is one where we think about the Austrian business cycle theory. It's a situation where the Federal Reserve pumps money into the economy, which lowers interest rates, and it kind of falsely creates a boom, and then we end up with a bust that proceeds because we have a false boom that happened. Now, a lot of people point to the Austrian story and say, well, wait a minute, right? If we think about the Austrian story and we're saying that we injected a bunch of money into the economy, wouldn't that cause inflation, right? So wouldn't we expect to see that, oh, there was a bunch of inflation during the 1920s, and then we get the bust of the late 1920s, early 1930s, and the Great Depression that follows? Well, there was a booming 1920s. It's the roaring 20s after all. But the price level remained the same throughout that decade. How can the Austrians possibly tell this story then? Well, with innovation, if we think of cost-cutting measures, which were particularly happening during the 1920s, where all of a sudden we're, adding innovation to assembly lines and things like this, where we're cutting lots of costs to our production ability. With that innovation, you would expect that prices would be falling, right? That we would have cheaper, lower prices. And yet what we ended up with is constant price level. Well, how do we get reduced costs from innovation and yet still see the same price level? The solution to that could be that we have increases in the money supply. So one Austrian theory that is put forward is that the money supply was being inflated even though prices weren't on the rise. Murray Rothbard in particular puts forward this view. He estimated that the Fed puffed up the money supply by 60% between 1921 and 1928. It was this easy money from the Fed that fueled the stock market surge and the roar of the roaring 20s. The Fed, after all, was rather novice. It was only created in 1913. And there was a small but sharp deflationary recession in 1920, where the Fed essentially did nothing. And the recession was over before they could even act. Well, the Fed, being young and having this experience of a deflationary recession in 1920, came up with a game plan and said, we can't let that happen again. We escaped that recession rather quickly, but it nonetheless happened, and we need to learn from it. The Fed response was to not be caught off guard and without action in the future. What do we see? Prices kept from falling in the 1920s after this recession, and active discretionary policy once the next recession hits. The Fed had changed their procedure after that recession, and one of their changes was to keep that price level constant. And so as we were having costs reduced, the Fed didn't want deflation, so they kept that price level stable, but they're pumping money into the economy during the 1920s. And hence we get the roar of the roaring 20s. We get this buildup of the stock exchange. We get this boom, but eventually it leads to a bust. Now, Austrian business cycle theory could be a story of the 1929 stock market crash, but it doesn't seem like it could help us explain a decade-long depression. Maybe the start of it, but not the entire thing. To again quickly overview another cause of the Great Depression, what happened at the start of everything. Some blame the gold standard and fixed exchange rates. So many European nations went off the gold standard during World War I, and then there was a reversion back to the gold standard after the war. When this happened, some, but not all, came back to the gold standard at the original price ratio. So much had changed with the war happening, increased spending, and now changes in prices, and now moving back to a gold standard, that this alone could have created some macroeconomic mess. Add to this that some exchange rates were fixed, and we have these large monetary regimes trying to balance everything out, and we've got a monetary mess going on. There's massive reshuffling of gold across countries, and the uncertainties of the policies within countries certainly could have been at the start of major macroeconomic failings and the major macroeconomic failings that we saw at the start of the Great Depression. But debate still remains. The popular view, or as I put it, the stereotypical high school history view, is that the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression. The Dow opened in 1929 at 300, and it boomed up to 381 by September. That's just 9 months later, we get a move from 300 to 381. But by November, it was down to 199. So we go from the start of 1929 at 300 to September, we get 381 to November, we're at 199. The drop from 260 to 230 on October 29th alone is referred to as Black Tuesday. This is one of the lessons that is usually taught in a history class along with the Great Depression to set everything up. We talk about the stock market, bust, Black Tuesday, the end, we have a Great Depression. Why do high school history stories end here, though? Did you know that by April of 1930, the Dow was back to 294? This is only 6 points shy of where it was 16 months prior. Other drops in stock market like this have occurred, and no decade-long depressions have followed them. The stock market crash can be an element of some problems, but it cannot be the cause of a decade of depression, especially when there was a bounce back within a year. So that story just doesn't really add up. So here we've overviewed just a couple of the potential stories about the root cause of the Great Depression. And we really have debate here. We have the stock market story, we have the gold standard and fixed exchange rate story, we have the Austrian story. There's other stories about what caused things with monetary policy and other issues that were happening during the roaring 1920s. But we really have debate over this. So this is not an area where we can say we know something about the Great Depression without any contention. We have some knowledge that we have here, but there's no clear-cut examples. Next up, we're going to quickly overview how we got out of the Depression, or stories about how we got out of the Depression as well. So click the video to go on to the next video in the series.